Hi, it's Paul Arnold here, Stuttering Professor. Today I just want to review with you a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He was the Nobel Peace Prize winner for economics and has written quite a lot of books in the field of behavioural economics. And this is, probably the most dense, the most complete of all the various books which I've read on behavioural economics. So let's take you through some of the key principles which he talks about. I think the fundamental principle of behavioural economics is that we are not like these sort of econs. We're not like, how economics would suggest we make purely rational decisions, weighing up the pros and cons of all options available. And actually, in reality, we are very inefficient, ineffective decision makers. And we're often influenced by seemingly irrelevant information. And we often rely upon these shortcuts that, work for us 95% of the time, which we call heuristics, but actually, sometimes really get into the way. And we're heavily influenced by immediacy and personal experience. And he comes up with a particular phrase which is called Wysiati, which said, what you see is all there is, because we know that these things influence us incredibly. And then actually also a part of that is that emotions often derail our rational thinking process, and a lot of the work in neuroscience has definitely shown about how emotions are our primary way that we do make decisions. Now, one of the things he does is he develops a metaphorical way that the brain works, in that what he suggests is that what we do is that we have a system 1 brain and a system 2, and system 1 is very much linked into that primitive part of the brain. It's very unconscious and drives 90% of all the decision making that we tend to do. Very emotionally driven, very intuitive, incredibly powerful, very fast, uses very little activity, seems to run itself very well. But that said, is heavily influenced and can make false decisions based upon just grabbing information that it has open to itself. And it's also very much about making meanings, and therefore can actually jump to false conclusions a lot of the time. Now, the system 2 brain is very much linked to the newer part of the brain, which is the neocortex part of the brain. But actually, in evolution terms, it's a very young part of the brain, and therefore hasn't fully developed yet. Come back in about another million years' time, and I'm sure we'll be much better at this part. But it's a conscious part, it's very rational, it's very methodical, but it's a very small processing power, and it can't handle much information at any one time. If you were to try to compare, the system 2 brain is almost like a little sort of pocket calculator, versus the system 1 is the intelligence system that sits inside the sort of pentagon. Such is the differential power, which is why we're often mistaken to think we should run everything through our system 2, the logical, rational part of the brain. The other thing about the system 2 is that because it's a very slow processing power, it is very slow and very heavy on its use of sort of energy, and therefore it tires very easily. And as soon as it tires, it becomes the victim of the system 1. Because the system 2 almost like checks and balances system 1, but actually if it gets distracted or gets tired, it can often sort of just let system 1 have its way, particularly in high emotional situations. So let's talk a little bit more about this Wysiati, what you see is all there is. Because the reality is that when we make decisions as human beings, we make upon a very small amount of total information available. In other words, what you see is all there is. So what is within the conscious part of the brain is all we use to go and make our decisions with. And actually, if you sort of have stuff in there which is actually irrelevant, strangely enough, it still gets taken account of and still plays a role inside this. But what we know is that the more vivid, the more concrete, the more likely the items are going to be at top of mind for us, are going to be what we call salient. And this sort of links back into the other book which I reviewed about how brands grow, which is very much about, we need to have this mental availability. And we know that emotionality increases the we remember things that are highly emotional for us. And it often means we can overinflate events and think they are more powerful and more influential than they actually are. So if you ask people, they're going to think that events like dying from lightning or volcanoes or plane crashes or are more likely than actually the truth is from people dying in swimming pool accidents, asthma and diabetes. Which comes back to this principle he talks about priming. And what priming is this idea that, again, sort of things that may not be particularly relevant are relevant, and they do influence our decision making. So one of the classic experiments done is you say to people, what's the tallest redwood? To one group you say, is it more or less than 1,200 feet? And to another group, is it more or less than 120 feet? And when you say that to them, you then ask them after that, what is the height do you think is the tallest redwood? And the 1,200 or the 120 basically primes them to be thinking around those numbers. And therefore context absolutely affects, the way we perceive things. Anchoring is another principle he talks about. And this is the thing that, we get anchored by an initial thought that's been put into our heads. It's another form of priming. So when a buyer, puts a house on the market, that list price anchors us to that price, give or take a small percentage amount. If it was anchored there or anchored there, that's what you will then negotiate around. So therefore anchoring plays a very important part. Because we are lazy decision makers, we find it very hard to make decisions. So therefore, what you find is that people, by and large, will therefore rely upon other devices to help us make decisions. So we often do a comparative context. So we'll often compare things, because the reality is we are not optimizers. We are satisficers. We don't want to make a bad decision. We are prepared to just go with an okay decision as long as it's not the worst decision, and we're okay to compromise upon not having the very best decision. So we're satisficers rather than optimizers. So we'll compare and contrast. Now that therefore brings into mind that the comparative base you use, and what you're comparing with absolutely influences your ability to actually affect that decision making. So with the power of loss, what we have is we are sort of evolutionarily wired to be more aware of risks, which would make absolute sense. That's why we're still alive. And we therefore value a loss twice as high as that of a gain. And even looking at the animal kingdom, animals fight much harder to defend their land than to gain new land. In the world, we tend to sort of hold on to poor performing stocks because we've lost our initial income we put into it, and now we're trying to get it back. So we hold on to it and hold on to it as it's going down. And to compensate for our losses, what we do, we mistakenly sell that good stock, which doesn't make sense, but such is the emotional fear of loss, it therefore has that impact. Which comes us on to a principle which is called the endowment principle. And this is, again, a form of loss, which is this idea that things that you already own, you value much more highly than things you don't own. And there have been some lovely experiments done whereby people will sell a ticket that they own to a ball game at a much higher price than they'll be prepared to go and pay for it up front, because they fear the giving away of something which they already own. And I want to talk about mental accounting. Mental accounting is a principle that we tend to store money in different ways. We don't treat a dollar as a dollar as a dollar. We tend to treat it very differently. So people will have their holiday saving funds, but actually they'll still be running up debts on their credit cards. There's a nice experiment was done. Imagine you are going to the theatre and you have bought $160 worth of tickets. And on the way there, you lose the 2 tickets. Now, the debate is, would you rebuy them again? Well, you wouldn't do, because you think, well, I've already paid for them once. Why would I do it again? However, if you had lost $160, the cash you were going to use when you got to the theatre to buy the tickets, would you go and still buy the tickets? And most times people say, yes, I'll still buy the ticket, because we've divorced the two. So we've got to be very careful about mental accounting. We tend to view money in slightly different ways. It's the same with sunk costs. We tend to ignore the initial purchase price of things so we can just like focus on the incremental difference. So we may be saying, oh, this car is much more economical. But the reality is you've ignored the initial price you paid for the car in the first place. It's the same with these new coffee machines. You focus on the price of the pod, but you ignore the price of buying the coffee unit itself. What often happens is over life we have ups and we have downs, you have ups and downs, and basically by and large we start to regress towards a norm. So if we had a really good year, we'll probably go back down to a medium year, and maybe go to a lower year, we'll be not so good, and we'll come up, but we'll regress towards a norm. So he talks about this idea about how there is the myth of being on Sports Illustrated, that if you're on the front cover of that, therefore the next year your career takes negative bounce. And the reason is only because you were so successful that year that you tend to therefore be going down the year after. And likewise in companies, you have many of these companies who are written about in all of these management guru type books, in search of excellence and similar books, that these companies are no longer doing as well, because the reality in most companies, they're going to go down, they're going to go up, they're going to go up, they're going to go down, and therefore things tend to sort of balance out over a longer period of time. He also talked about this principle called luck. And he said the definition of success is a lot to do with luck. There's a lot of luck that goes on in the world, and some people are lucky and some people are unlucky. And he says the definition of success for him is talent plus luck. And he said the definition of great success is a little more talent and a lot more luck. So in summary of the book, it's a very dense book. It takes a long time to go through. You can sort of look online at my book summary of it. I think it's a great book. I think it is the most complete of all the behavioural economics books, and I would certainly recommend it as a good read. Thank you.